Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me at Behind the Headlines, coming to you with another great interview. I'm Lee Camp. This is streaming on multiple platforms. Thank you for being here. Please leave a comment, click subscribe, all that good stuff. And don't forget to check out all the interviews we've done, such as with Stella Assange, Julian Assange's wife, economist Richard Wolff, Pulitzer Prize winner Chris Hedges. Check all those out at youtube.com/behind the headlines. But today I am very excited to speak with someone who is roughly a million times more informed on China than I am. And I think this is one of the most important topics going on right now in our world is as the US government likes to call it, the great power conflict between China and the US. But we'll get into a lot more than just that. Anyway, joining me today is Josef Gregory Mahoney. He's a PhD and professor of politics and international relations, also a director of the International Graduate Program in Politics, and an executive director of the International Center for Advanced Political Studies at East China Normal University in Shanghai. So, welcome, Josef. Hello.
Hey, Lee. How you doing, man?
I'm doing all right. It was a pleasure to meet you in person in Beijing there. My brief trip there, my only trip I've gotten to Beijing, whereas you are very different. You've been in China for a while now, correct?
Yeah, I've been living in Shanghai for the past 13 years. Prior to that, I was living in Beijing. I worked for a think tank under the Central Committee there and part of the party intellectual apparatus. But I first started coming to China in 1998, up in the northeastern part, and then so I've had a longer frame of reference or horizon, but and have got to see or observe firsthand a lot of changes. But no, I was really looking forward to the show, and I just got a text from a friend of mine in Hong Kong, a colleague, and she's saying, "Oh, you're going on Lee Camp show," and I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, I think he uses the F word a lot. I hope you don't. I hope you don't do that yourself." So, if you would, at the earliest convenience, drop an F bomb as a shout out to my colleague in Hong Kong, that would tickle me. Thank you.
You're goddamn straight. I fucking will. I tend to curse less in the interviews than I do when I'm ranting and raving on my own. But yeah, I appreciate that. As Lewis Black said, I come from a comedy background. So as Lewis Black said, if you look around at what's going on in the world and you don't at least think in your head, fuck, then there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, no, there are things. I think we both realize there are things that you should have a sense of humor about, but you should also be fucking furious about, right? I mean, these things are piling up on our doorstep now, and obviously China is closely related to a lot of those conversations. So let's get into it. What can I do?
Yes, let's get into it. So you know a lot about Chinese cultural and political culture, far more than I do, and probably far more than most anybody does outside of China. Can you explain your thoughts on China's foreign policy? And I know this may take a bit, and we have the time for it, so let's do it. Your thoughts on what makes China's foreign policy different from the way the U.S. government and maybe even U.S. citizens view the geopolitical machinations and where things stand now?
Well, it's a very big topic, and clearly we have, I think very specific statements that come from the foreign minister or from Xi Jinping or the political apparatus in Beijing that try to, formally explain these things. And, we could, repeat all of that. But I think the key point is, at least from my perspective, someone who grew up in the United States, who grew up during the Reagan period, for the most part, really began to think about the world and social studies, growing up in Haleyville, Alabama, right, the middle of nowhere, a place that I still love and respect. But if you know the United States, you should immediately get a picture of what I mean. And we used to get the little, what were they called, the little weekly reader or whatever,
Yeah.
and they would give you like pictures of the world, and who was America's friends and who was not America's friends, and it was like a world map, and then it would be like, okay, so there's like this huge red part of the world, and I remember even in the 1980s, it was like China was like in this weird color, or maybe it was shading, that China was something other than. But the key point here is that you probably a little bit, because you're a little bit younger than me, but not much. Sorry to say, but nevertheless, we we understand that old Cold War discourse, and we also understand that it's come back. Now, people are debating whether or not the Cold War is back. Certainly, I think in some respects, it's back in terms of, what we saw towards the end of the Obama administration with the so-called pivot, what we saw accelerating with Trump, and then even accelerating further with Biden. And so we see the rehash of these old narratives of there's the Chinese Communist Party, right? We always have to know, if you're in America, there's like, no one ever misses the opportunity to say the Chinese Communist Party when they're talking about China, and to link this immediately with some sort of existential struggle between the United States and China. Now, sometimes we dress it up as great power competition, but there's always this narrative that goes on along with it, that what China is really trying to do is displace the United States as the global hegemon, right? And that the United States has to resist this, because China's evil, or that whatever the shortcomings are of the United States, at least they're better. But if we let it go, then everything's going to fall apart. There's like this apocalyptic vision associated with it. And again, I remember growing up in Alabama, and people having these bomb shelters, and I don't know if you remember that awful made-for-TV movie, The Day After, right? And
I heard about it, never saw it.
Yeah. And so, we all watched that. We all watched that show. And then the next day at school, we talked about it. We talked about, would you want to survive? Would you, if a lot of your friends were dead, would you? And we used to have these, Cold War drills where we had to go out. And it was the same as the tornado drill, where you had to go out and you had to like put your head down between your knees. And I remember someone said, this kid in my class, he was always a smartass, and someone says, "Why do we have to do this?" And he says, "So you can kiss your ass goodbye."
Right. Exactly.
If it's a nuclear war, you're fucked. Okay. So, but that was like sort of the low grade terror that we grew up with. And to be honest with you, that is coming back, but where I am feeling it is here. In other words, China is increasingly concerned, and I don't know that Americans are aware of this. I don't know that they're thinking the same way, but China is increasingly concerned that the United States is trying to bait it into a war, and that we have experts and others who think, okay, this could happen in the next 2 to 5 years, right? Now, if there's a war between the United States and China, it's a global war. It's catastrophic, right?
Yeah.
It destroys the economy of both countries. It has tremendous implications for spiraling outward. It could involve, weapons of mass destruction. It would certainly imperil the environment and contribute negatively to climate change. But there is this immediate concern that the United States is trying to position itself vis-a-vis Taiwan in a way that replicates what some people in the world view what the U.S. has done vis-a-vis Ukraine. Okay, so that's the concern that is slowly building here, and I don't know that Americans are thinking about it the same way. I don't know the extent to which they're tied into it, but this leads me into a discussion of Chinese foreign policy, right? This is sort of the broader context,
Yeah.
which is, um, firstly, China doesn't want to dominate the world. Why? Because to put it in the most vulgar terms, it isn't satisfied with its capacity to govern itself. In other words, it has a political system that takes on so much responsibility, that is driven to elevate all these different aspects of Chinese society, and it's constantly pushing its own political system to the breaking point. Right? In other words, how can we do this, do this, do this, do this? It has absolutely no. Go ahead.
Can I just throw in the number for those who don't know that over the past 30 years, China has elevated 850 million people out of extreme poverty in China. And those numbers are agreed upon by the UN and others. So,
but it's over 800 million out of poverty and eliminated extreme poverty. And then I think the term that has to follow that is that, they've now created a middle income population exceeding 400 million, which is greater than the entire population of the United States. And, doing this in a way that is historically unprecedented. Now, there's hope that in the next 20 years that we might see similar gains in India. Maybe that's true. Maybe they're going to get their act together. It hasn't happened yet. They both achieved sort of not national India independence, and China, in ending the Civil War, roughly the same period of time. But anyway, so yes, so you're right that China has made this tremendous leap forward in terms of its own development and bringing some form of socialist democracy to its people. And keeping in mind that when China talks about democracy, one of the first point that they make is that Chinese people rule China. In other words, we're not a country that doesn't have an independent foreign policy. We're not a country that's occupied or being controlled, as China was for roughly 100 years before. We're not a country that is vulnerable to outside manipulation. We are still a country that is vulnerable to international aggression, but China feels very confident that they have not only reestablished their sovereignty, but created themselves as a strong nation that can stand up for itself and advance the interest of its people. And again, I think the UN and many other groups would agree that that's the case. So to go back to that earlier thread, China doesn't want to take responsibility for the social, religious, cultural, economic problems of Afghanistan or Cambodia or any other place, right? It is never satisfied with the extent to which it can take responsibility for itself. And furthermore, something that the Chinese themselves always say, although they don't always articulate this in the best way, is that the Chinese system only works in China. I think they could say one thing that they could say better is that it's not exportable. Okay. In other words, the way the party system works from the top down to the bottom, from the level of the president down to the neighborhood committees, and how it extends into all these different aspects of life. It's the example that I give is it's kind of like Hinduism, in so much as Hinduism is not really portable. Buddhism is portable. Buddhism can spread cross-culturally. It can spread across different nations, but Hinduism doesn't. Wherever Hindus go, they can take Hinduism, but Hinduism is so linked to, for better or worse, to caste, that it doesn't, freely move across culture. The party is something similar. China never has this idea that it has the universal political system, the way the U.S. sometimes does, and the way the U.S. tries to export or impose on others. China doesn't do this. They say, okay, this is the way we do it, and this is what works for us. And then, what works for you is what you need to figure out. Now, we can work with you in some respects. We can do business with you. We can trade with you. We can look for win-win opportunities. But when it comes to how you govern yourself and where you're going in terms of your own vision and your own destiny, that's on you. Okay, so it's really quite different from that old Cold War narrative that we saw previously when we were imagining the Cold War in the U.S. versus the USSR, right? Where the USSR did have this, the Warsaw Pact and all these other countries that were nominally independent, but relatively less so. There have been critics who allege that there was a Soviet empire, that there was a center of the Soviet world, and that not all countries were equals or treated fairly. Anyway, the Chinese model is really quite a bit different in this respect. The other thing is that China, if you want to look at a different angle, China has taken development goals associated with the Belt and Road Initiative, but more recently with what they call the Global Development Initiative, the GDI. So, for example, there are these UN development goals, 2030 development goals, and because of the global downturn associated with the pandemic, it became clear that there were going to be shortfalls in reaching some of these development goals that had been part of the UN mandate for some time. And so China built the Global Development Initiative, placed it in the UN, aligned it with those development goals for 2030, and then started trying to rally other countries into this. And now they have more than 100 that have come in, and it's looking for opportunities. Okay, where can we invest? Where can we bring this project? Where can we do this in order to get these efforts back online, right? So my point is that this is really about trying to move in a very explicitly democratic direction in terms of international relations, where we say, okay, we're going to do this through the UN. It's not going to be unilateral, right? Now, the final point here is that I think in the context of the growing fear associated with war and conflict, and above all with what we've seen from the United States trying to construct this Indo-Pacific concept, where they're trying to leverage Japan into remilitarization, where they're upgrading this very controversial missile system in South Korea, where they are providing advanced arms, and there are now reports that there are U.S. military personnel in Taiwan. The U.S. is now staging B-52 nuclear-capable bombers in northern Australia. They're going to sell nuclear submarines to Australia. We have this ongoing effort by the Biden administration to expand NATO in a confrontation with China. And so what we've really seen China accelerating in the past year is this new initiative called the Global Security Initiative. And the first major achievement associated with this was the negotiating the resumption of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then we see Xi Jinping immediately going to Moscow, promoting China's proposal for finding a diplomatic resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. And I think that, in fact, they have several other conflicts or unresolved tension areas in mind that include what we might call Greater Asia, from East Asia all the way over across Russia and into the Middle East and even Northern Africa. So And in fact, Xi Jinping has been very clear about this. He says, we can start building world peace in Asia and then expand outward. But the key point here is that I think China is becoming militant about peace. I mean, for a long time, they've been one of the biggest contributors to the UN peacekeeping program, and supporting those types of efforts. But I think China realizes the only way to really stop this U.S. aggression, and above all, this U.S. attempt to characterize China as an aggressive power, is to just become a champion for peace. And maybe I'm being a little too optimistic, but I think I think this is where we have to say, okay, go China, go, right? If you can,
we want peace. Yeah.
We want peace, right? And if
Yeah.
you're saying that's what you want, and you're getting Iran and Saudi Arabia to talk, and you cannot, okay, I don't care what color it is, let's do it.
And I just want to remind everybody that in the past many decades, China is not cooing countries, they're not bombing countries, they're not assassinating leaders. This is something the U.S. has done regularly and continues to do to this day. I think the Pentagon doesn't release these numbers anymore, but Obama's final year in office, the military under him dropped 26,000 bombs across the year. The first year of Trump, it was 40,000 bombs. And the U.S. has 800 to 900 military bases around the world. We're looking to expand that now. And China has one military base outside of China. It's a big difference.
And it goes beyond that. The point about, when you ask people, okay, well, where is China being an aggressor? There's this diehard impression, and it's funny because I talk to friends and people in the United States, and they always want to explain the real China to me, and I'm like, okay, let's see what you have. But right. When you say, okay, show me where China is being an aggressor, right? And they say, well, they're being an aggressor in Hong Kong. Well, that's China, okay? They're being an aggressor in the South China Sea. Not really. What they're doing in the South China Sea is trying to prepare a better defensive position, given the pressure that the U.S. is increasing in the South China Sea, right? I mean, everything is really about trying to create a more robust national defense in light of very clearly expressed, very clearly advancing positioning by the U.S. of nuclear weapons, nuclear submarines, troops. They just the funny thing that if it got swallowed up by the hysteria with the weather balloon, but a couple of days before the weather balloon, which Biden exploits as a talking point for his State of the Union speech, is that they had just negotiated expanded access for U.S. troops in the Philippines, right? So all of this is what's really taking place, is this massive repositioning, and the question is why? Why, if China is not really a threat, that China isn't sailing ships up and down the U.S. coast or flying planes up and down the U.S. coast like the U.S. is doing. They're not selling dangerous weapons to Cuba or Honduras or Nicaragua or Mexico or any of these places, right? So why is it that the U.S. is taking such an aggressive position? What is it? What's really driving this? Right? Because it isn't actually China that's driving it through aggression. Right. China is merely reacting. Reacting against the aggression that's being directed at it. So anyway.
Well. So let's get into what's driving the U.S. fear. Some would, I guess, would say paranoia, but to me, it's not. The truth is, it's not about paranoia. It's about the U.S. views China's economic rise, the ruling elite of the U.S., as an existential threat to U.S. hegemony. And that gets deep into things like the petrodollar. And so I want to get your thoughts on that rather than me just talking about it.
Well, I was at this I was at this meeting in Yunnan the weekend before I met you. It was a global poverty conference, and there were all these ambassadors from various countries there. And we were talking about the petrodollar, but we were also talking. And there was one ambassador from a Middle Eastern country. I won't name which country because I haven't said whether or not I can quote him in international media. And he was fixated on the American military-industrial complex, saying, "Okay, well, the U.S. Always has to have something that feeds this machine," and for 20 years it had the Cold War, and then it transitioned into the war on terror, and it's transitioning from the war on terror to a new Cold War with China. And I think obviously there's certainly an economy of war that exists. We know, for example, that the U.S. is a big part of the U.S. economy is selling weapons and being engaged in that type of activity. But I think that we too often overemphasize that, because I think that there are bigger issues now. And the two bigger issues, I think, are and here one I really, I think, amuse some people. But one of them, I think, is that we are, I think, facing growing intersecting crises associated with climate change. And this is, in my view, prompting some strategic end games that are being played. And I think that there's a strategic end game being played, for example, between the United States and Russia, two countries that are dependent on fossil fuels, right? Two countries that, in Russia's case, that benefit tremendously from global warming, right? Number one, they want to sell their best resource, and that best resource is melting the snow and ice that's going to open up more resources for them.
Right.
But in the case of the United States, it's a little bit different. We know, for example, that Biden just signed papers to expand drilling in Alaska, and we know that this has angered Saudi Arabia, and it's had some impact on Saudi decisions recently with respect to not only cutting production but also moving towards clearing or selling oil in something denominated other than dollars, right? So the key point here is that, okay, the U.S. is moving to become perhaps one of the biggest oil producers in the world, and certainly is moving to play that supplier role in Europe that was previously played by Russia. But there's another thing that the U.S. is really concerned about, which is what you've already mentioned, which is the petrodollar. Okay, and so the key point here is that in my estimation, I'm not an economist, but in my estimation, and other people I think have a similar view, the U.S. economy. There is a real economy in the U.S. There are people who have real jobs. There are people who produce real things, but a very, very large part of the U.S. economy is a house of cards built on the dollar. Okay. Yeah. And the dollar as the supranational currency. And interestingly, we know, I don't know if you saw the little blip from Donald Trump as he was, reflecting on his day of humiliation, of course, and linking America's decline with his own. And, if that's what it takes, okay, maybe that's what we have to suffer through to get rid of that asshole. But But it was funny because one of the things he talked about was the coming collapse of the dollar. Right now, the dollar as the supranational currency or the global reserve currency, however you want to, it's underpinned by its role as the petrodollar. Okay,
Mhm.
so if we are moving more and more towards green energy, and by the way, the world leader in green energy of innovating and promoting green energy now is China by far, right? If we are moving more and more to green energy, and if we're moving away from oil, then what this means is that what underpins the dollar is in decline, right?
Yeah.
And so the U.S. is facing this existential crisis that if all of a sudden the petrodollar system collapses, what we could see is a collapse of the dollar, which would be absolutely an existential event for the U.S.
Yeah.
And it would be an existential, economically, it'd be an existential event for the whole world. I mean, the whole world right now, it's like addicted to, I mean, I don't use drugs, but some people do use drugs, and you get hooked on a drug, and you have to like keep taking the, like maybe heroin, right? Like you have to like keep getting your fix or you get sick, right? So everyone right now is addicted to the dollar, and that includes, unfortunately, China. The dollar would be done right now if China wasn't interested in still earning lots of dollars from the record trade that it had with the U.S. last year, despite the trade war and the fact that so much of the trade that China does around the world, for example, China is the largest trading partner of the most number of countries in the world, and most of that trade is done through dollars. And China is not really that interested in exposing its own currency to global currency markets right now, for two reasons. One, because they could fucking explode at any point, right? And so one of the ways that you're insulating yourself from that approaching danger is to not be too exposed to it, but also because China, by keeping control over its currency, they increase their capacity for what they call macro controls and their ability to better manage their economy. Now, it's interesting because if you remind me to go back to the key word here, Ming Dynasty, I'll connect something interesting to that in a moment. But the thing to circle back more immediately to is that
Can I just throw one thing in here?
Yeah.
That exactly what you were just talking about with China gives them the control over their choices is the exact opposite of part of the reason the euro was put into play in Europe. The people that created it, there's some great quotes floating around internally where they said, well, it takes monetary policy out of the hands of these individual nations. And we saw it with Greece. Greece had no choice but to do whatever the World Bank and the EU told them to do. So it's kind of exactly the opposite of what you're saying China it has been able to maintain.
Right. But a number of points here. The first is before the war in Ukraine started, you had Russia, the EU, and China talking about moving beyond the petrodollar.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't want to be conspiratorial and say, okay, that's what triggered, everything. But this has in fact been a trend due to three things, right? First, what happened in 2008, right? In 2008, the U.S. had or instigated, let's say, the global financial crisis, right? And the economy collapsed. It collapsed. And the night of the collapse, the Federal Reserve imagined $1 trillion into existence and kept liquidity, kept the markets afloat. And then we had this extra constitution. I don't know why scholars don't talk about this. It's like some sort of collective amnesia. But if you recall, we had the Treasury Secretary, we had the Fed Reserve Chairman, and Bush. It's like, what do you call this?
Cabal?
When you have like a triumvirate or something, right? And they started making these life or death decisions on which companies, lived or died, right? I mean, what law gave them that power? What constitution gave, and so you talk, my point is, the rest of the world looked at what happened in '08, looked at how the Fed was able to just create money, something that no one else can do in the same way, right? And then externalize the risks across the rest of the world.
Right.
So you've had this tremendous failure in management. It's a bipartisan in terms of governance. You had both parties taking money from the same corporations and the same banks and the same Wall Street and completely deregulated. And you were deregulated because you've been stuck in this cycle of regulation since the 1980s, and you keep having to regulate more to make up for it, that you keep hollowing out for your economy and the class thought. So okay, it's like the moment where the rest of the world goes.
So I have lost your feed almost. We had, oh wait, is it coming back? Maybe I'm waiting to see if it stays bad. Maybe try logging back on, logging out and logging on, if you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, let's try you logging out and logging in again.
All right.
Sorry about that, folks. By the way, before we started, we tried this where he logged out and logged back in, and it worked great. So hopefully that's the case, and we'll have him back in a second. To continue on the points he's making, and I'm going to try my best. I know we only have 25 minutes left to get to some of your questions, assuming this feed gets fixed. But to get to what he was saying is the U.S. and I know I've said this many times, so stop me if you heard it. No, just kidding. But we print insane amounts of money, $1 trillion a year for the military, which is more than 140 countries combined. And then we turn around and say, our dollar still has value. It still has a lot of value. Well, why is that? Well, it's just because of the petrodollar, which is the reason it's the reserve currency. All right, well, he's back, but I don't actually see any video for him. Well, I'll leave that up and see if it works for a second. Oh, this would be so frustrating if it's... Wait, no. Okay. I think we got you.
Okay.
Okay, great. So I don't know if you remember where you were, but...
Yeah, no, I was hearing you talk about the petrodollar. So to go back, and I don't want to interrupt your stream, but so '08 was this wake up call, and then it's funny because we had we had all of this. U.S. created all this. Okay, we all need to come together and work to resolve the global financial crisis, right?
Right.
And
that's where we need to come together.
Yeah. And we had so we're gonna fix this problem, and I remember I was in Beijing, and they were talking about, okay, well, what happens if there's another economic crisis in the United States? And I remember this party leader said, China will be the first ambulance to arrive to save America will be from China. Okay, because we need, we like doing business with America. We like growing our economy. So
and then China owns a crazy amount of U.S. debt.
At that time, yeah, they've been slowly divesting themselves away from that garbage. But no, yeah, and of course China is still heavily invested in that. But then the next moment in time, and there were many other little moments, but the next major moment in time here is 2020. Okay, in 2020, just to put it in context, okay, so we had a lot of other little problems. We had, okay, the debt is still rising. We have political resistance to raising the debt ceiling. There's this idea that U.S. is playing chicken with the global economy because of its own political polarization. And what does that mean? All right. And then we had the conflict in Ukraine, starting with Crimea. And this is where we have this big sanctions regime started by the United States. Okay, so that is moving along, and that's really irritating, obviously, Russia, but it's raising some eyebrows in some other places. But then we get to the real second point, which is 2020, and in 2020, what happens is the U.S. has this catastrophic response to the pandemic, and in order to pay for this mess, the Federal Reserve increases the dollar supply by 20%, right? They just, boom, 20%. How, no other country in the world has the power to do that and not collapse into massive inflation, right?
$4.5 trillion funneled to Wall Street. Yeah.
Yes. So the first thing is we increase the money supply. And then second, trillions of dollars in these, stimuluses, a lot of which went to companies and individuals that didn't need them.
Right.
I think I got a couple of $1,000s. I can't remember. I was trapped in America because of COVID at that time, so I needed that money to survive. But anyway, at the same time in 2020, you had China, which has recovered, contained, reestablished production, and the Chinese economy saves the global economy in 2020. Not only saves the global economy, but is producing the things that people actually need to survive, the PP&E. I remember I had to buy an extra computer because my kids were now forced to go online, and one of the computers was, like one of my old Apples from like 2009. And so I had to buy a new computer, but I had to wait 2 weeks for it to arrive because it had to be manufactured in Guangdong, right? Okay, because everyone was buying computers. So I have to buy this Apple from China so that my son can go to school online because we've done such a shitty job of taking care of things.
Yeah.
Now, and I'm using my stimulus check to buy this computer to compensate for the poor governments. Now, if we want to go back to, okay, where do we see the start of inflation in the United States? It begins here, but it also begins with the trade war against China. That's where we begin to see these prices increase. This is where we begin to see U.S. consumers paying more because of the tariffs that the U.S. is imposing on Chinese products, but also then on top of this, what we're doing vis-a-vis the Fed. Now, the rest of the world sees this, but then the third point, the point that has brought us to where we are now is what happens after we see the conflict in Ukraine accelerate, and we see this incredible financial sanctions regime being imposed on Russia, right? And I'm not taking a position here whether or not that was fair, right, or wrong in terms of our conversation. Nevertheless, that's when Modi in India says, "Okay, I need a plan to get off the dollar." That's when Joko Widodo in Indonesia is saying, "We need a plan to get off the dollar." And if we can stop doing any transactions related to MasterCard and Visa, that would be great too, because we need to because the U.S. is now using this nuclear option, given their power over the global financial system, and we're all at risk.
Along with the SWIFT system,
Right. So it's also what we have seen accelerating just in the past few weeks, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. We're starting to see Russia and China will clear purchases without the dollar. India and Russia without the dollar. Brazil and China without the dollar. We saw the energy exchange here in Shanghai, a French company in China clearing in yuan. We see, if you go back to where the conflict begins between Saudi Arabia and Iran, it's linked to the petrodollar. The U.S. was supporting the Shah in Iran because the Shah was committed to supporting the petrodollar.
Right.
Unfortunately, the Shah belonged to a corrupt regime that had lost the confidence of the majority of the Iranian people. And when the Islamic Republic, which, again, I don't want to take a position and say, okay, I like everything the Islamic Republic does, but I'm not Iranian, and it's not really my business. But the point is that Saudi Arabia was committed to the petrodollar, and Iran was breaking from that. And so this is part of where we begin to see, through the U.S. working in tandem with Saudi Arabia against Iranian interest, and then of course this accelerating with the U.S. Supporting Saddam Hussein in a war against Iran back in the day.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to ask, because I don't want to run out of time with you, which I would hate to run out and not have gotten to some things. And so one of the things I was wondering if we could shift to was a conversation you and I started to have in China, and then we got kind of interrupted. But it had to do with kind of the difference in Chinese thought or political thought. And I believe you said it had to do with the dialectic of contradiction. And I was wondering if you could, try and explain that. And if there's a 10 minutes or less version, I don't know if there is, but.
I teach a whole graduate seminar over 18 weeks.
So it's not 10 minutes.
It's not a 10-minute conversation, but what I can say is this: in the 11-minute version of it, if I kid myself. So, without trying to fall into a lecture, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
In Western thought, and Western thought, we have to say, okay, obviously that includes the United States, but we can go back to the Greeks, to the ancient Greeks, and beyond, right? And I'll get to the beyond in just a moment. There is an expression that more often than not has been called the law of thought. It was the principle that is guiding what is considered to be logical and rational in thinking, and this is expressed very nicely by Aristotle as the law of non-contradiction. And I'm not going to go into the three laws and how the first law and the third law are derived from the second law. The second law is the law of non-contradiction. That would be the 18-week version. But what it means is something can't both be something and not something at the same time. I have this little donkey here, right?
Yeah.
And this donkey cannot be a donkey, and a plastic donkey, and not a donkey at the same time. Now, that seems pretty straightforward and pretty logical, right? But if we start taking it into a slightly more complicated, Lee Camp can't be Lee Camp and not Lee Camp at the same time. Okay, well, what is it specifically that makes Lee Camp Lee Camp? And is Lee Camp not someone who, has competing perspectives, and he presents himself in different ways to different people, so forth and so on? All right. Now, conversely, one more point here is that, in fact, Aristotle's not the only ancient to articulate the law of non-contradiction. It was also articulated in the Hindu Vedas, right? And so what is significant about this is, okay, was it that Aristotle learned this in some ways from the Hindus? And every time I talk to Hindus, they say, well, it's possible. It's possible he stole it from us. And I go, it is possible. There's no record of it, but Heidegger plagiarized Kokuso Okakura, and he didn't leave a record of that, although we know he did it. Okay, so and the thesis that I like best here, or the theory I like best, is that the law of non-contradiction may be prefigured linguistically. In other words, there's something about the way we think in Western languages that predisposes us to the law of non-contradiction. And now, why would there be a link between the Vedas and Aristotle? And the reason is because ancient Greek and Sanskrit belong to the same family of languages, right? And why is it then that we see people like Ibn Rushd or Ibn Sina, these incredibly influential Islamic philosophers who radicalize Aristotle even further? And Aristotle makes sense to, well, there are compelling academic arguments that the Semitic family of languages belongs within the Indo-European family, or they should be, but for anti-Semitic reasons, they've been excluded. Okay. Or maybe it's just that they had so much sharing through the centuries. Now, what's interesting is that radical, so Aristotle Aristotelian thought is largely banned from Europe after Augustine advances his Platonic-based theology as Rome is collapsing. And so this is when, Europe slips into the Dark Ages, where the light goes off or goes out, and because we lose this foundation that had grown up around Aristotelian thought and science. But it comes back because of the threat associated with the Muslims, and this is this radical idea of Aristotle that gets written right into Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica in the middle of the 13th century, which in turn sparks the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, which gives rise to this radical cogito, ego-based subjectivity, individualism, existentialism, Protestantism, nationalism, capitalism. All of these isms are products of this radical new way of thinking that is the radicalized version of this old law from Aristotle. Now, and in the middle of this, we have someone like Immanuel Kant, who in his Critique of Pure Reason will say, okay, so there are two ways of thinking. There's what he normatively calls the linear or the analytical, which he says is based on Aristotelian thought. And then there's the dialectic. And he says the dialectic, in his lectures on logic, he says the dialectic is the logic of illusion. It's metaphysical juggling. He says it's basically bullshit. Okay, we can't get rid of it altogether because there are some contradictions. But here I'm being ridiculous. Let's put it in a shoebox and put it in the back of the closet and forget that we ever had anything to do with it. Now, conversely, what we have in China, going back to, let's say, we can see it being expressed firstly during the Shang dynasty, when the Chinese start to innovate writing as a system. And this is, 16th to the middle part of the Shang dynasty, which runs, let's see, I think 16th to the 11th century BCE, right? So a considerable period of time. What we see being expressed in Chinese thought is not the law of contradiction, not the law of non-contradiction, and not the opposite of the law of non-contradiction. They don't say the law of contradiction. What they have is their own expression, which is the unity of opposites. Mm. Okay. And so I know that some of your listeners will be familiar with Taoism, with the yin yang, right? And the yin yang, I think, is clearly, a very powerful symbol. I think, unfortunately, so many people in the West misunderstand it because they tend to view it through this Western law of non-contradiction way of thinking. It's okay, we got the good and the evil, the black and the white. Okay. But in the real meaning of that symbol is that it's like you're looking down at a cup of coffee and someone has poured some heavy cream into it, right? And you can see that it's swirling. Okay, so you can see that there's black in the white and there's white in the black. But the real point is you're not supposed to see the world in binary terms. Mm. At best, what you're supposed to see, what you're really supposed to see when you see this, but you can't draw it, so we represent it this way, is that life, experience, whatever, is ever-shifting shades of gray, right? That we're all together and we all belong. And this principle, of course, gets expressed as the first principle of Taoist thought, which is the necessity of promoting harmony between man and nature. All right. So, and by the way, this concept has come back to the fore in the last several years. Really come back into the last several years with Beijing promoting building an ecological civilization. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just want to. I think that some of these concepts are so deep that you may understand all of the things implicated in them, but I want to ask a question here or there about, like, so you're saying that in Chinese language, which I know nothing about, it's more baked into the thought that these contradictions coexist and that's what the world is. And so to put that onto a political reasoning, the Chinese are far more capable of, or at least more capable of having, capitalism with communism in the country, or, having the two systems with Hong Kong, or believing the U.S. can have our version of democracy, which is not a democracy, and China could have their version of democracy, those type of things.
Yeah, I think they're actually, all the points you raise are really clear examples where we can see this way of thinking at work, this dialectical way of thinking. But there's something important that happens to this way of thinking with the introduction of Marxism to China. And so the introduction, the problem with Taoism, or what we might call the yin-yang thought, that is based on the unity of opposites. The problem with that is that it had a tendency towards an idealism. So if you know anything about the trigrams in the Book of Changes, this idea that you can map out how states move from one state to the other when you don't really know anything about physics is clearly overreaching. But the point is that when with Marx, and we have, this starts with Hegel, and again, I don't want to go in too deep of a direction, but Hegel responds to Kant and says, it's understandable that Kant shit on the dialectic because in the West we never developed it. So then Hegel undertakes to develop the dialectic, but what Hegel never says, okay, we need to have the dialectic and get rid of the analytic. He says, no, Kant is right. There are two ways of thinking, and human beings need both ways of thinking. However, there are strengths and weaknesses in both ways of thinking, and you have to use both to compensate for the weaknesses in each other, but also to give a broader perspective where you can begin to reconcile those differences. So when you had after the May 4th movement, which took place in 1919 at Peking University, or in Chinese Beida, Beijing Daxue, in the library there, you had an early Chinese Marxist, Li Dajiao, who was leading the Marxist studies group, and Mao Zedong was working there as a librarian assistant. And as they're starting to read Marxism, and the reason they're reading Marxism is because it's just a couple of years after the October Revolution, and so you now have to, because China's facing this crisis of consciousness after the Treaty of Versailles had given the former German concession to Japan, right? And so you had done all these things to try to modernize with the Shanghai Revolution in 1911, where you'd overthrown the dynastic system and started the Republic of China, and yet it doesn't work. It doesn't provide you with a path to national salvation. So there are all these various schools around China trying to find what they call the solution to Chinese consciousness, or the solution to the crisis of Chinese consciousness. And as they're looking at Marx, they're saying, oh my God, there's the dialectic, right? There's the dialectic. That's something that resonates with us because we have this way of thinking. In the dialectic, what do? You because we haven't introduced this, but you say, okay, there are contradictions, and contradictions are in a struggle to reach higher stages of progress, and so as they're as they're reading Marx, what they're seeing is that the dialectical materialism of Marx will strengthen yin-yang thought. And those yin-yang thought is too idealistic, but we can bring a more materialist base to it with Marx's dialectical materialism. But in addition to this, Marx provides, and this is a point that a lot of Western Marxists take for granted, Marx provides, and he takes this in part from Hegel, an epistemological bridge to the analytic, which is something that China did not have a very strong tradition of, okay? And they need that bridge in order to develop as a modern nation, to accelerate their industrial development. Because if they don't, they're not going to be able to withstand this international pressure that has been knocking them down for decades. So this is where Marxism will accommodate but strengthen a native way of thinking that has roots that goes back thousands of years, but also bridge into this other way of thinking, which is compellingly necessary in order to see this sort of technological progress and to close this technology gap that had left China vulnerable to the West. Given the experience that the U.S. had by the West had in terms of accelerating its own technological development because of the radicalization of linear or analytical thought. So it's in that context that you have someone like Mao Zedong who is thinking dialectically, right? But it's not just dialectically, he's also bringing the analytic into play. And this is where you have things like, okay, one country, later with Deng Xiaoping, so it starts with Mao Zedong, but then it continues with Deng Xiaoping, and then we see it with the third generation of leadership with Jiang Zemin, and then even with the fourth with Hu Jintao, and now fifth with Xi Jinping. This idea of, okay, one country, two systems, or the socialist market economy. These are profoundly dialectical concepts that are looking at how do we manage contradictions? How do we do this in a way that moves us forward in a constructive way? But the most interesting thing, the most interesting contradiction, if you study Chinese politics, is the contradiction of the party itself, right? Mm-hmm. The first magic trick that the party learns, and it has to learn this in order to save itself, is how to radically change itself. And once it figured out how to profoundly revolutionize itself and to a lesser extent reform itself, then it began to figure out how to revolutionize and reform China. And this is what it continues to do. It continues to reinvent itself through time in order to meet what they perpetually call the primary contradiction or the various contradictions that require address. And so, in a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was a week or so ago, the new foreign minister, Qin Gang, referenced, I think he called it, I think the official translation was principle. I think we used to call it primary contradiction. We called it the principal contradiction. He says, the United States is trying to say that what we have in the world is a conflict between democratic and authoritarian regimes. He says, actually, the principal contradiction is between countries that are trying to develop and developed countries that are trying to stymie their development, right? And he says, this is what we're focused on. We're trying to avoid a containment. We're trying to help the global South develop. We're trying to develop further ourselves and the global South together, because that's what we're going to need to move forward. So this language and this way of thinking, we also see it in this concept, this central economic concept that we see in Beijing, the dual circulation model. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, is that this way of thinking remains powerfully instrumental in the way the party thinks. The way the party thinks about foreign affairs, the way it thinks about domestic policy, the way it thinks about dealing with problems, including whatever problems that arise within itself institutionally. But there is or has been some concern, starting with what we call the 90s generation, the Zhou Ho, and it was those kids that were born in the 90s, and they were the kids that started growing up in this market society, right? And so there was this concern for many years that these kids were thinking differently and Beijing, God bless them, they were concerned. Okay, maybe it's Japanese soft power, anime, or Hollywood that's corrupting our young people. And some of us Marxists were saying, no, dummy. As Marx says, your consciousness is shaped fundamentally in some profound way, right, by the economic system that you live in, right? And you have advanced this market society to such an extent that it's changed the way people think, and it's made them more egocentric. It's made them more individualistic. And it's not just Marx who says this. Margaret Mead talks about this as well in her studies on generation gaps in countries where you see accelerated economic development along market lines. And so, interestingly, about 4 or 5 years ago, Beijing wakes up to this, and they start reinvesting in Marxist education, which.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which it's very self-serving for me to say. I completely applaud, because I teach the Marxism the seminars on Marxism, not only at my university, but I guest lecture at several others. And so there's this very clear understanding that okay, so young people have been tipping too far into this analytical, individual, ego-based subjectivity, or what others would call cogito subjectivity, taking the term from Descartes. And what we need to do is reintroduce them to Marx. We need to reintroduce them to the dialectic, because that's the way, that's the way we think. That's something that's worked compellingly well for us. But we don't want our young people drifting into this, into what they see as a self-destructive form of being. So I think this has been recognized, and they've been trying to shore that up with these younger generations.
It sounds like how the market economy ultimately works in a capitalist society. Is it separates us, it atomizes us, and it makes all of our needs greed based, and puts a dollar sign on everything, including the air, the water, the life. And your labor, and in fact, even your blood. I've been talking more and more about this, that the U.S. is the #1 exporter of paid blood. In fact, more dollar-wise, more than corn or soy in the U.S. And so we've become a literal vampiric nation, sucking blood from the poor, which is, a good thing to know. But anyway, it's been,
I'm O negative. I'm glad I'm here. I don't want nobody sucking on my blood. I got the most valuable blood in the world.
It was an honor to have you on, and I know it's 11 p.m. there, so I think I should wrap this up. But it'd be easy to chat with you for 5-6 hours, but I'm not going to do that. But thank you so much for what we were able to get through. It appears everybody in the chat really loved it, and one person was asking if you have any way to catch any of your lectures or writings or anything online that they can keep following, because I think a lot of people are sad to see you go.
Yeah, I'll say I don't do a lot of social media. I do a lot of media. I'm on TV 2 or 3 times a week. I'm on LinkedIn. I know a lot of people aren't on LinkedIn, but you can find me under my full name, Josef Gregory Mahoney, Joseph with an F, Joseph like Joseph Stalin. So you can see, like, I put the links for the TV shows sometimes on Al Jazeera, or I'm not on BBC anymore. I'm blacklisted there, but CGTN. I do stuff out of Hong Kong. But
I imagine with Western media, you are similar to like me or Chris Hedges, where you'll be at a network for a bit, and then it gets you get blacklisted or stopped or shut down.
Yeah, eventually, it's amazing, right? It doesn't take long for them to figure out that you don't belong to their audience. But anyway, the other thing I would say is, people are free to reach out to me. We do have a master's and PhD program here at the university. We do teach it in English. We do teach Marxism. We do have scholarships. It's right now is the time to apply, but they're generous scholarships. And what's interesting is, if you're an American, you're almost guaranteed a scholarship, because there's actually secretly a deal between the U.S. and China, where because for so many years the China was sending Chinese students, and so the deal was, okay, if any Americans come, then it will be reimbursed. So that there's like, so we have scholarships for people all over the world, but we have almost an unlimited supply of scholarships for Americans, and the scholarship is free housing, free tuition, um, um, free tuition, free housing, free health insurance, and a monthly stipend. It's enough to live on. And it's here in the heart of Shanghai, beautiful campus. And I'd be happy to talk with anyone. Is it ridiculous, or should I not put my email in the chat? Is that dangerous?
That's up to you. I mean, I don't think it'd be a real problem, but
you know what I'll do? See if I can.
I mean, if they can find you on LinkedIn or something, that's probably.
Yeah, they can find me on LinkedIn, but I have a program email with the university, but we just merged our department with the School of International Relations. So now we're the School of Politics and International Relations. So they changed the at.
Right.
I haven't used the new one yet, so I don't want to say what it is, but I'll send it to you, and if you can post it, fine. If not, they can just find me on LinkedIn.
We can add it to the description. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So it was a pleasure, man. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I hope to speak again with you soon.
I hope so too. Take care.
Take care. All right. Hope you folks enjoyed that. I know I certainly did. That's Josef Gregory Mahoney, and that's he's a professor at the East China Normal University in Shanghai, an American who grew up in Alabama, of all places. See, who says Alabama can't export amazingly brilliant professors to China? I think he might be the only one. I think if they have an annual get together of the Alabaman Marxist professors and living in China, he might be the only one there. Anyway, thank you so much for being here. I do these interviews twice a week. It's all at youtube.com/behind the headlines. I just had a new episode of the Most Censored News just came out, and I will put a link to that. It's about the water wars that are heating up here in the U.S., and I just put that link in the comment thread as well. But if you can't see that, you can just go to youtube.com/behind the headlines, and I will see you soon with another episode. Thanks again. Oh, and support us, patreon.com/behind the headlines. Keep fighting.